Mr. Francis, thank you so much for coming to speak with us at UN News.
It's a pleasure being here.
Thank you
Thank
very
you
much.
for having me.
And belated congratulations on your appointment. I think this is the first time we're speaking to you, so on behalf of myself and my colleagues, congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And let's get into the interview then. So, in your first speech to the UN General Assembly, you reminded world leaders of your focus on 4 areas or your priorities: peace, prosperity, progress, and sustainability. Now, all of these are in peril in some degree, and sometimes for overlapping reasons. How are you ensuring that countries will unite to address these challenges?
Well, they are united primarily through the Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda 2030, because that is a broad, unifying development agenda that brings the 193 members of the United Nations together to take action in concert in order to lift people out of poverty, deprivation, hunger, malnutrition, etc., and to create the conditions, sustainable conditions, to transform the world into a more sustainable way of operating. So it's about the planet as much as it is about people, but it is really a people's driven agenda to ensure that human beings that occupy this planet live their lives in dignity, so that they can pursue their dreams. And this agenda is a unifying agenda, so we are all 193 member states committed to making this happen. Now, that's the development platform of the work of the UN. But we are also united in other ways, because when peace and security is disrupted, such as it has been in the last 2 or 3 years in particular, the impact is consequential for everyone. It's in all our interests to promote and to secure peace, because the lack of peace, the lack of harmony in the system, undermines the system and makes complicated all of the other great goals and objectives that we have. So that you would be aware, for example, that progress on the Sustainable Development Goals have been challenged. They're off track in virtually every arm of the goals. Thankfully, heads of state and government met in September in New York at the request of the Secretary General and recommitted to working, charging ahead 100% to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. That remains one of the main objectives of the UN and of the General Assembly, even as we address the other pillars, peace and security being one, human rights being the other.
Thank you, sir. And now, of course, you mentioned of disruptions to peace and security, and we cannot go without talking about what is currently happening in the Middle East, which has to be the worst escalation that we've seen in our lifetimes. The conflict between Israel and Gaza has created a catastrophic humanitarian crisis. The conflict between Israel and Hamas has created a catastrophic humanitarian crisis in Gaza and is also putting the wider region at risk. Can the General Assembly exert any influence here?
Well, we have. We have, because 2.5 weeks ago, the General Assembly successfully adopted what is the first resolution coming out of the United Nations system on the situation in Gaza, calling for a ceasefire, calling for the release, unconditional release of all of the hostages, and also calling for the provision of humanitarian aid and support, so that the people who need that support in Gaza would have it. Now, put into context the fact that at that time, the Security Council of the United Nations had met and tried to agree a resolution on 4 separate occasions and had failed. So the General Assembly, in fact, was able to come up with a resolution for which there was a broad consensus. 121 countries, I believe, supported it. The focus of that resolution being to save human lives, particularly civilian lives, and to provide relief, support, and assistance to those people within Gaza who needed it. That, I think, has been a big contribution made by the United Nations, because in furtherance of the goals of the Charter, which is to save humanity from the scourge of war, we were able to bring forward this resolution as a way of stopping the war. We've said plainly in that resolution that what the General Assembly desires, is a ceasefire in order to save human lives. 11,000 people dead as a consequence of the action in Gaza is too much. It's unspeakable and it is unacceptable. And so we've called for that, but also emphasizing the necessity for Hamas to return the hostages to their families, unconditionally so.
Thank you. And yes, you reminded us the General Assembly, of course, it unites all 193 UN member states.
Yes.
And your resolutions, the General Assembly resolutions, though non-binding, they do carry moral weight. They reflect the conscience of the globe.
Absolutely.
But
they make a political declaration on the part of the majority of members of the international community. And in a sense, they create a sort of soft law, because resolutions of the General Assembly represent, in a sense, the conscience of humanity, the dominant view of humanity. We never get unanimity in resolutions, but when you can command more than 2/3 of the votes in the House, that's a powerful symbol, a powerful message of agreement, of consensus. And that's what we were able to do. The hope is, our desire is, our call on all the relevant players is that they would honor and implement that resolution alongside the resolution that was agreed on Wednesday in the Security Council.
And I know you mentioned that, of course, this is a reflection of the conscience of the majority of UN states.
Yes.
Is that enough? I mean, because some people might say, oh, well, that's kind of like the diplomatic version of it's the thought that counts. Do you know what I mean?
But the thought does count. The thought does count. If you listen carefully to the positions and the views that are being reflected, the big debate is about principles and values. So the thought does count. The politics only arises insofar as there is a different point of view and differing points of view. So thoughts count and are powerful. That is why a resolution passed in the General Assembly assumes a high degree of importance, because it bears powerful political messages. That is why countries negotiate these resolutions with such energy and dedication, because they appreciate the potential impact it's going to have publicly. No country, most countries that I'm aware of, are not comfortable feeling themselves politically isolated. Countries are like human beings. Human beings like to be appreciated, loved. They like to feel the respect and support of their friends. They want to engage. They want to have a conversation. We were meant to be that way. Countries are no different. Because when you build those bridges of relationships, it widens the space within which you can act as a country, as a sovereign. When you do not have those supporting relationships, the options you have narrow significantly. And so that is the import of a General Assembly resolution. It provides the messaging that can make a big difference politically. And since public opinion always plays a role in these matters, we must keep that in mind. Countries are keen to appreciate how their behaviors are being seen in the public domain.
Thank you. Now, speaking about building bridges,
Mm-hmm.
one of the areas of one of your priorities or concerns is the status of the so-called least developed countries
Yes.
in the world. And particularly, we know that many are trapped in debt
Yes?
because of mostly because of, or actually let me rephrase that, many are trapped in debt because of the current structure of the current global financial architecture.
Yes?
The Secretary General himself has also said it's outdated many times.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us what action the General Assembly can take in this regard?
Well, the global financial architecture is outdated. It was set up at a time in the late 1940s when most of the countries that exist now did not exist at all. We were not members of the United Nations, the so-called Global South, the Group of 77 and China that I believe comprises approximately 140 countries, did not exist. So you have a global financial architecture that was designed at a different time with goals and objectives that did not take into account the developmental needs and priorities nor peculiarities of developing countries. Take, for example, landlocked states that are experiencing great difficulty. The cost of everything in a landlocked state is twice as high as in the average coastal state because of the fact that they are isolated from the sea. So consumers who live in that country have to pay twice what the average consumer in a coastal state will pay. That constitutes hardship. It's the same thing in small island developing states, many of which are isolated because they are far away from global markets. And in LDCs, you're right, I've prioritized this group of what we refer to as countries in vulnerable situations because they are developmentally stretched. The system has not really catered or been designed to take into account the needs of those countries and to help and support them to move up the developmental ladder in a sustainable way. Hence the call of the Secretary General and others like myself for the global financial architecture to be revisited, for the terms and conditions of lending, of borrowing from global financial institutions to be improved, the terms of access, the interest rates, for example. If you are a SIDS in the Caribbean and every year your infrastructure is being destroyed by hurricanes, you have to keep reinvesting year after year in the construction of the same bridge or the same road because of the cyclical patterns with which hurricanes come in the Atlantic hurricane season. That actually means that money that is needed to be used for health, for education, gets gobbled up rebuilding the same infrastructure every 2 or 4 years. In effect, you're standing still. Other areas of need have to be postponed in order to deal with the reconstruction after hurricanes. That's not a pragmatic or reasonable way in which to develop. In fact, it makes development well nigh impossible. So we are calling for a number of things to happen, for the question of gross domestic product to be replaced by an index that takes better account of the developmental peculiarities of SIDS and other developing countries, that is based more on the extent of their resilience. GDP is only a snapshot in time, and it masks and camouflages a lot of developmental negatives that are not captured in gross domestic product. So that you have in the past, countries have been graduated from receiving concessional loans, but once graduated, within a year or two, they've slipped back down the ladder, simply because they cannot mobilize the funding domestically in order to support the development. And the consequence of this has been a widening of the gap between the rich and powerful and those who are left behind. That is why one of the fundamental principles of the Sustainable Development Goals is no one left behind. It's as much applicable to countries as it is applicable to individuals. That development must be all-inclusive. Everyone must fit under the umbrella. It cannot be development to the benefit of some and at the expense of others. That is not development. It might represent growth, but not development. There's a distinction. What we want, what we seek, what we're pursuing assiduously is sustainable development, where all boats gets lifted, so everyone benefits. That is what will make the system sustainable.
Thank you. I believe we may have time for 2 more questions, you think? Okay, great. I'd like to ask you about the high-level week in September. You mentioned it earlier, particularly the meeting with about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, where countries reaffirmed their commitment. But this was, of course, your first as President of the General Assembly.
Yes.
But you're no stranger to the UN. You're a veteran diplomat from Trinidad and Tobago, in the Caribbean. And I would like to know for you, I mean, other than, of course, being president, was there anything special or anything different about this particular General Assembly that's just passed?
It was very different. It was very different. It was enormously different because High Level Week consisted of a number of very important, discrete components. One of which was the SDG Summit, which was quite a success, and I congratulate the Secretary General in that regard. But we also had adopted during that week 3 important declarations on health issues. As you know, the pandemic really revealed a lot about the way we are organized at present. And there was a desire for us to reflect on what lessons have been learned about global preparedness in the event there should be another pandemic. Incidentally, you may be aware that the climate scientists have kept warning us that because of the warming of the atmosphere, the likelihood is that there will be more frequent pandemics and they are likely to be more virulent. So pragmatism dictates that we prepare ourselves organizationally to cope better with future pandemics. And so heads of state and government agreed on a declaration regarding pandemic preparedness, prevention, and there are 3 Ps, the last one eludes me. They also agreed a document on universal health care, and they also agreed a declaration on tuberculosis, which has made a comeback. There was a point in time when we felt that we had solved the problem of tuberculosis. Well, newsflash, it's back, and it's back big time, as a real threat to the health and stability of the global system of populations across the world. And these 3 health documents were approved. The missions in Geneva are now working on the development of a treaty regarding pandemic preparedness and prevention. And it is hoped that that can be prepared in time for when heads of state and government meet next year in September 2024. But that's one of the unique outcomes of this year's high-level week. There was also a meeting of ministers regarding the Summit of the Future, which is the sequel, if you will, to the work that is being done on the SDGs. The Summit of the Future is a look into the future to sort of determine what are the key issues that will come onto the global agenda and define how we organize internationally to cope with the issues of the day. So it's a bit of futuristic planning based on patterns we are seeing now. And that is going to be the next big area of work for the United Nations. We are, in fact, gearing up to do that work. There will be some intense negotiations. They've already begun, but they will really intensify very early next year in order to prepare this in time for high-level week next year. So this was a very unique and different high-level week. A lot was achieved. And I'm happy to say that one of the greatest outcomes was, in fact, the reaffirmation of the need to move full speed ahead on the Sustainable Development Goals. We need them.
Thank you. My final question, I think we're good. Right. Finally now, thank you very much for reminding us about the importance of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is current, the present era, and of course the Summit of the Future, which will be held next year, again to push the goals forward, showing really the wonderful work that the UN is doing and the need for countries to come together, cooperate. But there's this idea among some people, there's criticism that the United Nations is outdated and ineffective, and by extension, they're also criticizing the General Assembly. How do you defend against such criticism, or what do you say when people have those kinds of views about the UN?
Well, first of all, people have the right to their views. They have the right to their views. I would encourage them, however, to engage with us a little bit more. Because what people see in the news, in a 1-minute news bite on the 7 o'clock news, does not constitute the entirety of the work of the UN. Having said that, I would also say that the UN itself is not insensitive to the fact that there's a kind of lethargy and disappointment out there with how the UN has been performing of late. But let me say this. The UN is an organization comprised of 193 members. The UN does not exist out there on its own. It's comprised of 193 sovereign governments. That word sovereign is very important because it means that those governments can and do make decisions based on their national interest and priorities. And what the UN does is create a platform for them to come together to try to agree common approaches to various global problems, a la climate change, a la the pandemic, a la sea level rise, a la global terrorism, a la human rights, a la women's rights, a la education. The UN system continues to play a powerful role in the lives of ordinary people. Take, for example, UNESCO. Everybody wants to send their child to school so that their child has access to quality education. because education is the ultimate liberator. UNESCO establishes relevant standards for education. Not just education, education and culture. Take, for example, the World Health Organization that establishes standards for public health, that has effectively dealt with the issue of malaria. So I'll ask this. If the UN is irrelevant, what would you replace it with? And so I say to people, thank God the UN exists, because it creates a much needed platform for coordination, consultation, and cooperation among 193 states that would otherwise have no means and no opportunity to meet, to coordinate, to solve global problems and issues. That's a powerful and potentially groundbreaking, earth-shattering achievement that the UN has made over the years, and besides, prevented World War III. It has not happened. I'll end on that note.
Mr. Francis, thank you very much for taking the time to meet with us today.
Thank you.
Good day.